Now we will talk about some of the novel starches. As we know that starch from different crops, they would have different morphology, different structure, and this difference actually can be very much valuable for biotechnologists, where they can take one component from one plant and transform into different other crop, and this difference between crops can be very much exploited for the favor of industry, or making very much useful novel starches for different applications. The major areas in which this novelty has been extensively studied or discussed. These are the change in the relative proportion of amylose content or amylopectin content, the phosphate content in these starches. Similarly, the amount of protein that are present in these different starches, or that can be modified. Phospholipids, amount of phospholipids in different modified starches has been discussed. The crystalline structure or crystallinity property of these different starches has been discussed. The gelation property, as we earlier discussed, pasting characteristics. These are all different avenues in which people have tried different approaches to develop different novel starches. Similarly, flavor and the starch grain morphology. These are the areas in which different novel starches either have been reported, or there are people working on these different areas to produce different novel starches. So we'll see some of them, some of the details, like what have been actually done in reality. We know that different crops could have different properties, though, and they can be, as I said, they can be shifted from one plant to another. Especially this phosphate content. There's a high phosphate content in potato. This property can be taken up. And this can be transformed into the other plants. For example, if you have got high phosphate content in certain starches, they would have more transparency. The end product that is made, they are more transparent. Unlike especially for wheat starches, where you've got more phospholipids, if you have got high amount of phospholipid, they are more opaque structure that are formed from these starches once they are dissolved or the products are made. So this property can be exploited as a novel starch when we try to have more phosphate content produced in certain crops. So we can have different possibilities of having these phosphate content introduced into other crops, and they would have different impacts on the starches that are produced. For example, it might have different digestibility characteristic. The viscosity might be different. As I earlier said, this viscosity would be again linked to the transparency or opaqueness of these final products that are made by having high phosphate content in these kind of starches. Another avenue is actually to look at the genes which are responsible for the texture within the endosperm. So this is one of the interesting area in which some of people are working, and we know that there are some of the puroindoline genes that are described as PinA or PinB. They are very much interesting candidate, because we know that they can transform the wheat genes into rice to produce the softer texture or softness in the seed. So this has been exploited to make desirable grain softness for these rice products, which are actually favored for certain cooking practices. As I said, grain morphology is one of the area in which people are working. It would be very much variable from species to species or crop to crop. But again, it would have desirable food applications once we have different morphology. It's much more visible to the eye as well, and that can be exploited in terms of different food applications. We have made some progress in this to actually control this morphology, but there are not much success in this area. But the major success that has come through is the granule size control, the control in the granule size of these starches that has been reported, and there are more interest in the scientific community regarding these kind of novel starches. Another area is flavor. That can be very much important in many crops. For example, in cassava, it has got a bland taste or flavor, which is desirable. In other starches, in some crops, the flavor are not desirable, such as sorghum or other crops, it has got more mealy kind of flavor, which is not desirable. So this is an area that can be exploited, that we can have bland flavor, novel starches. We can take these genes from cassava, add into another crops, and then we can produce some novel starches. Similarly, we don't, as we discuss about grain morphology, the understanding of the genetic components, that would be these determining these kind of properties about flavor or morphology. They are not very much well understood at this stage. But of course, the science keeps on, growing. People keep on working, and they keep on exploring new avenues. But these are some of the avenues. Then there is another concept of bifunctional domains, where we can actually look at the relative proportion of cellulose versus starches in certain crops. And this is an interesting area because this material science or making up new biomaterial is a very hot area in which a lot of people are working, and this area is really being exploited by the scientists world over to make new kind of biomaterials. So this is one of the very interesting area in which novel starches can be made. Biotechnology applications can be breakthrough application. I think in this area they are very, very, very important. Another important application is the incorporation of inulin. Inulin is one of the functional food component that has got many functional properties, such as it can reduce constipation, it is good for irritable bowel syndrome, it has got some anti-cancer properties that has been reported. So if we can incorporate this inulin into starches, the novel starches would have much better functional and nutritional properties that can be exploited. Then there could be some other things, such as we can have different gene construct that can incorporate certain proteins, certain fusion proteins that can be incorporated in these starches, and those would change the properties of these starches in a way that they might be having different bioactive proteins can be added, different enzymes can be added, and these novel starches might have different applications which have got desirable outcome in many food product or industrial applications. So these are some of the areas in which people have either made some progress or they are trying to make progress in terms of in this domain of novel starches or production of novel starches.